Thanks so much for being here for this special screening of The Faithful, The King, the Pope, and the Princess. This film is written, directed, and produced by Annie Berman, who we're lucky enough to have here tonight for a Q&A after the screening. She'll be joined by Ralph Burns, who's a photographer and is also featured in the documentary. So be sure to stick around. Screening runs around 90 minutes or so with the Q&A immediately to follow. So should be a good night. Thanks for being here and enjoy the show. All right. Please welcome Annie Berman and Ralph Burns. I am so happy to have you here. I have to say, I think this might be my favorite documentary that I've screened. I really love this film. I think, Ralph, are you there with us? I just want to make sure.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you so much for hosting us tonight. It's so nice to be here. And
let's see.
I wish I were actually there in LA. Might be.
I know, it'd be so fun to do.
Here I am.
Ah, there you go.
Hi.
Ralph, I'm so glad you could join us too. Yeah, this would be a really fun one to do in person. I feel like the energy of this film lend itself so well to an in-person Q&A, but alas.
Alas, we'll do well. Let's see, I think am I still there? Yes, good.
Yeah, you're still with us.
Okay. Hi, Annie.
Hi, Ralph. I killed my mic because there's so much noise behind me.
Are they
so good to see you.
Are they putting up scaffolding on your building again?
That was our premiere night. They were putting up a scaffolding. Tonight, it's just the general New York City, everything.
I want to start with the most basic of questions. I mean, there's more here than we could possibly get to, but just to sort of situate us temporally within this whole thing, you present this looking at the lollipop almost as though that's the catalyst for this journey into fandom. Was that, in fact, the starting point of it? And if so, like, what year was that? Or do the origins of it in some ways trace back a little further? Which I think is probably a more loaded question than I mean it to be.
No, it's a great question, and I do take liberties in other places, but the lollipop I did not. I mean, it really was the lollipop. It was 1999, and I was a senior in undergrad, and I was studying philosophy of aesthetics and photography and all these things, and so these questions of authenticity and copy and the photograph were really in my mind. And I wasn't making a movie. I was just literally there visiting a friend, but I was president of the photo club, so I had access to film and developing for free. So I was there with just with film, and the part of the story that didn't make it in was that I was shooting slide film on this one occasion because I had this idea that I was really enamored by this Pope lollipop, and I thought, well, what do I want to do with it? Maybe I want to put that image onto other surfaces, because I was seeing how this reproduced image of the Pope could sell anything, and I was just really interested in that you could just keep going with it. So I thought, oh, I'll take my image, and then I'll just I was doing Polaroid transfers at the time, and so I thought, I'm just going to transfer this image onto different things and see what that means, But what happened was I did shoot that, and then when I got back home, my camera had jammed that day, and I thought, well, maybe it still came out, and it was really half exposed, and that also seemed kind of telling, like one of these strange signs that it had this light leak, and I still have that image, which yes. So because of that whole idea, it just felt like it went nowhere, and so it just was stuck within me. And then I graduated, and I had to figure out what to do, and I was trying to work for, I remember trying to get a job maybe as an intern for Lucia Small, the documentary filmmaker, and she she said, you've gotten grants before, you should really just go make your own film and not be my intern. And so then Matt, who was in the film, said, well, yeah, like I like that idea about the Pope Lollipop and Graceland, let's just go. And so we did. And that was a true story.
And Ralph, can you give us, since it's only briefly sort of featured in the film, can you kind of situate your own sort of origins in particularly the Elvis photo hunting that you do?
Sure. I first went in 1978. So the first year after he died. I was in Asheville, North Carolina at the time, and I was working in my darkroom. And my interest had been up until that point really about worship and loss and how humans deal with the notion of death and the brevity of life. I know that sounds really like a lighthearted thing, but it wasn't that terribly heavy for me. And I was working in my darkroom and I heard that Elvis Presley had died. And I said, oh, wait a minute. And a year passed. And then I heard that fans were gathering in Graceland for the first anniversary of his death. And literally just sort of stood up straight in the darkroom, finished the print I was working on, packed up, got in the car and drove to Graceland. And I thought it was about 5 hours. It turned out to be, seemed like a day and a half to get there. And I arrived late at night and this scene just unfolded in front of me. And it was a scene of sorrow, of love, of worship, of ritual, and of a strange camaraderie that I didn't expect. So I photographed the first year and I went back over a 30-year period on his, what they all refer to as death day or birthday. And I just did this rather large body of work that is called How Great Thou Art. And it's not my only body of work, but it seems to be the body of work that keeps popping up. So that was my kind of, it was a spontaneous understanding that something was happening that I needed to photograph. And that's what I did.
It strikes me that in the case of Elvis specifically, for both of you, your entry into his fandom as worship begins after death. Ralph, in your case, it actually, his death is almost the initiation into it. And Annie, for you, it was part of this other journey, but he had already long since passed. I think as a means of kind of diving deeper into that, the question that struck me, and in a way you could both kind of answer this, but it was directed towards Annie originally. At what point in this like 20-year journey did you have a sense of the story that these images were telling you? And especially if this answer differs, at what point did you realize the story you needed to tell? That might be like frustratingly vague of a question, but I want to leave it kind of ambiguous so you can really play with it and find the answer that kind of calls to you in there.
Yeah, thank you. I was letting the images speak to me. That was the process, and it was always with questions and not answers, and always more questions. And so the images presented new questions to me. At first the questions were really superficial in a way. It was about or superficial in this journey. But about at first it was this commodification idea about is anything holy, if and is everything can it turn everything into Mickey Mouse, including the Holy Father? And so it was with those kinds of thoughts that I went to Graceland, because I thought, well, what would seem normal on a lollipop? Elvis's face seems like the face that should be selling lollipops, or would be. And so I went there looking pretty much for lollipops, and you can find them very easily, not exactly lollipops, but and I was shooting a lot of that. I was shooting a lot of the merchandise, but playing with it, the way it would kind of distort itself on a person's body if it was a t-shirt, or and juxtaposing those kinds of things, and really I was still just so interested in images for images and not really people's stories quite at first, you know? And that came pretty quickly though, as I started to talk to people and like Ralph, I was really just, well, I was not expecting at all this candlelight vigil. I had read about it, I knew it existed, but I still, it's one of those things. It sounds so cliche to say you have to be there to experience it. And when I was interviewing people, people always kept saying that. Just like, yeah, but can you describe it for us? And maybe that is the truth, and that is what I kept pushing against with images. It's like, how much can an image tell you? What can it capture? What is the aura that's missing of being somewhere? And something we can think about now a lot as we are zooming, and what do we have, but then what is missing from what does a space give? What energy do people emit? And so the inquiry got deeper through images, but as I also understood more of what was behind them, because an image is nothing without a beholder, and all of that happens in someone's brain. And so I was having then to get deep into the brains of other people, which eventually led me deeper into my own brain.
Yeah. Ralph, does any of that resonate with you particularly? I can see where a lot of parallels would arise in your own journey.
Yes, a lot of that. It was a different time. Annie and I, our projects were 15 years apart, almost 13 years apart. I went to Graceland as much as an attempt to understand what was a morally damaged nation from Vietnam. I was very much of that generation, and I very much understood what had happened to the country in that process. And I also understood that there was a terrible loss from the Vietnam War in sort of what I always thought of as a moral center to the country. And I think when I first went to Graceland, I was sort of playing off of that theme a little bit, thinking that what I was following and finding and would find was a folk religion, something to replace what had been lost during the late 60s and the 70s in this horrific war. And it was an inquiry. I mean, I went the first time thinking that I would see what Annie described, really a commodification and a trivialization. And what I found was something much more meaningful and I thought much more tender than I had expected. And that really is what made me go back. I kept trying to understand that. I went back year after year, skipping periods, trying to get a better sense of what this was really saying about this very specific group of people, but all of us as humans. And at some point I realized that I was only then doing new chronology, that I wasn't getting any deeper. I couldn't get any deeper. I had understood whatever there was to understand, and I could keep taking photographs of it, which I did. I mean, I just would go back and take photographs. But I can't say that I ever came to a moment of clarity about what was going on there.
Did that feel true for you too, Annie? I mean, I feel like that to some extent the documentary points to this lack of clarity, and there's this sort of sense of everything, by necessity is left a little ambiguous. And in some way, that's actually where I feel like the film, and it's interesting to hear you talk about this aspect of textuality and image, because that actually was so integral since the beginning, because I do feel like it's almost how you allow structure into a film that is almost by design without structure. It gets grounded in its own sort of self-reflexive textuality to it. But I don't know, I guess is there any way you can sort of reflect on that a bit and sort of that the unanswered questions of it that keep you coming back?
Yeah, it's such a hard thing to figure out how can you, what's interesting to me is that the unknown. And so how can I present just enough for the viewer to get to experience some of that too, and ask some of those questions, and to be left with more questions, and to maybe also want to go and see for yourself. And so Yeah, I mean, and I was going back many years too, and not always knowing why either, right? And so it's a curious thing. It is.
So let's kind of dig more into this, because one of the things that I've been fascinated about. So we tried to get Henry Jenkins in here for this Q&A, and he couldn't, but I'm going to invoke him here because, you know, a debate that I've seen in his work and that I've kind of had in my own responses to it is about this distinction between religion and fandom, where there's a sense of it's quite blasphemous to sort of conflate the two. And yet I think actually in terms of how they operate within us, they're more similar than we usually allow ourselves to believe a lot of the time. And you focus on this aspect of worship and how it creates this, you know, you described wanting to believe when looking at the glass and kind of almost getting sucked into this obsession with the worship of it. And I think there's a lot to unpack there with sort of that blurred boundary of what you were observing. But I think I'd actually like to hear you reflect on sort of where it sat within you in capturing it. You know, you reference in the film getting so sucked into it and it becoming this obsession and almost becoming your own form of like almost contained worship. And I'd love for you just to sort of reflect on that a little bit, and especially seeing the film again now, is there any aspect of it that really speaks to you, of where you see where you were at in that moment in a way that maybe you didn't realize then or that you did?
Yeah, I think that it took, well, I mean, I joke about it being like the longest rite of passage, you know, kind of like people make their first film and it's my coming of age story, you know. And in many ways it was growing up very slowly. And part of that, I didn't really realize that I was looking for something like that. You know, I think in a way questioning what my place was, not just coming into the world for, you know, out of college, but the bigger sense of that and religion part of it without realizing it at all until maybe even very recently. I was taking a bath and listening to Enya, and there was a song I'd never heard before, and it was called Pilgrim. And there was something about that song, and I had to just then look at the lyrics, and because it hit me so deeply. It ends with Pilgrim, it's a long way to find out who you are. And it, you know, it doesn't sound like much when I'm saying it right now, but the way like it led to that final verse, I was like, what did she just say? So I was like, it was a really long way to find out who I was or am. And so yeah, I think that religion is a big part of that question, very unconsciously.
Yeah. So, but the decision to really infuse yourself, not just within the narrative, but almost structure this film as like a stream of conscious reflection on your own journey. When did that decision arise?
It came fairly late. You know, when I started this and I was shooting still photographs and then I was shooting Super 8, I was very much operating in this realm of short experimental films. And it was a strange process of this film, because as I was trying to get funding so that it could be my career, I was being geared into a certain type of filmmaking. And so I got a little lost in that as well, actually. At the time, and I think it's still true today, character-driven documentaries were like the thing to get funded and the popular thing to do. And so I made many versions that didn't have a narration and were driven by the people's stories in it. But I could never, it just was never enough for me. I just wasn't satisfied with the film. People liked it and thought it was close to done, and I could have just fine-tuned it and it would have been done. And at some point in conversations with a mentor of mine, she had indicated that, you know, these conversations we were having that I would get so excited about, with where the ideas came from, it was really impossible for that to come out otherwise, because everything, the whole reason these three icons make sense as a trinity, or is in my head. And so she really invited me to explore that, and then I started to, and that that took many versions as well, to find the balance and that voice.
And then within that process, I would assume, is when you came to the decision to bookend the film with your Aunt Nora. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, that is right. It really is true that I could understand this on another level when I was no longer shielded, from death. When death was something I understood very deeply, and the things that you see written on Graceland's wall or on the notes outside of Kensington Palace that really did seem so cliche to me, at the time I was filming them, but they just hit so hard. And when I was grieving, it's like, we'll never get over you, we'll never stop missing you, you're forever in my heart. And that, you hear the same things and they just mean something very, very deep to you at that moment. And so I could understand on that level. And actually, it's there are people in the film who I kept in touch with. And when this happened, including Ralph, I mean, these were the people I was on the phone with who did understand, who had the words for me, including Maria, who was at the gates of Kensington Palace, who's the poet. And I remember having a conversation with my brother when we got together as a family for a small memorial. And he's like, how come you're so good at this? Because I was talking through things with him and I didn't think I was. And I realized it was because I've been studying this for 20 years or, whatever. Yeah. And it was just something he was beginning to tackle. So.
It's so interesting because I could easily see it going the opposite way, where that sort of anger and resentment that one can feel over the death of someone close to them could actually drive them further away from these parasocial bonds that are happening. This is not a real, or some would say oh, this isn't a real connection. This is, you don't know the person, you don't have a personal relationship. How can you grieve someone you never met? And yet maybe because you were so entrenched with them for those 20 years, you had already felt sort of the reality of their grief. And then it kind of was contextualized even more when seen through the light of your own. Is that true for you too, Ralph? Is there a sense of how your own experiences you end up seeing reflected in this thing, that maybe you went in there as this more fly on the wall style documentarian wanting to just capture these moments, and in your own experiences, seeing that more and more reflected in this thing that perhaps for outsiders is harder to understand and how they directly correlate?
Yeah, no, that happened, of course. I mean, you lose your own immunity in a place like that. And I went really as a photographer at first, and I really understood that there was something happening in Graceland that needed to be documented, and I wanted to document it. But the longer I visited, the more time I spent there, the more I was touched by what I was watching. I mean, to the point that at times I'd be leaving Graceland, driving home, going, what is going on here? And I said, that's it, I'm never going back. And next year rolls around and I would go back again. And I have to say that in that group of people, perhaps because of their own vulnerability and their own sense of having been wounded, and that's a whole nother question, because there is a real wound there. I found an incredibly empathetic, sympathetic group of people. I had only a couple of occasions there where I felt threatened. And I can't say the same about photographing in some of the more traditional religious environments in which I photographed in, where I've been threatened often. So there was a kind of a funny little safe zone where I could work and I could photograph ritual, or at least ritual as it had been taken over and being used for another thing. and have a sense of my own humanness. And that became a very powerful thing for me. I understood, I think, with this crowd and with their ritual, something a little deeper about my own self, you know. But then I'd lose it. I'd drive home and then I'd go back next time. So it was always kind of a funny thing. But I had been doing this my whole life. When I was a young man, very young, I was in my mid-20s, I flew to Europe, bought a van and drove to India and beyond, and in the time when you could actually do that. And I didn't realize it at the beginning of the project, but I realized as I was doing it that I was really searching. I was searching probably for the same thing that I was finding at Graceland. And the odd thing was that these people had found that. You know, they had found whatever it was that filled that void or that need or the desire to come together around one point. And my role became simply to document that.
You know, you mentioned this thing of a wound. I actually didn't think I was going to steer in this direction, but it strikes me as I was listening to that, and I feel compelled to bring up this recent thing around the crown in England and Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, which like I'd only loosely followed, but my girlfriend is British, so we've had interesting conversations kind of about, and I don't want to spend long on it, but I am just curious if, for either of you, if your insight into fandom, especially Annie, your insight into maybe relationship to the crown and to that institution, if it has given you any particular insight or interest in sort of how that whole sequence has unraveled of, you know, because it intersects with issues of white supremacy, issues of just sort of class hierarchies and all these different aspects. And I would just love for either of your thoughts on this. If you had a reaction to it personally, if you've kind of sensed things from people you've talked to.
Go Annie.
Well, it's funny. I mean, on the one hand, I kind of stopped following it all. And but then everyone is telling, you know, everyone has their radar out for me. So it's like I get things emailed to me and obviously I read the news. I remember when this film, I was trying to finish it at certain times to peg it to certain moments so that our icons would be relevant. But the idea is that they're always relevant, which is so crazy, you know, in a way, because even before this, we would still see Princess Diana, who's now been gone, what is it, 24 years? Yeah. Still on the magazine rack at the supermarket. And when you go to the supermarket these days, who knows? Yeah, the idea that she is so relevant right now is fascinating. And I think the one thing I took away from that interview was just this part about, you know, Harry saying that he had this freedom because his mother had left this money for him, and that it was like she was still looking after him, and that it enabled this freedom for him. And maybe that's me now as a mother, but yeah, I that was sort of the thing. There's so much of interest in it. And there's just so much happening all of the time right now, because you saw this is not related at all to the royal family, but just about current events, because you saw that there was like a very short, hi Poochie.
Yeah, Poochie. Yeah, sorry everybody, but there's obviously a bear outside, so she will do this on and off. Matt, if you have to kill us, my sound, it's okay.
Ralph is not in New York City. There are no bears in the city. So. No, but just in the news this week was that Warhol case, and Warhol was briefly in The Faithful. And so,
I remember.
Yeah, so all of these issues just to come back and back and back.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just to tag into that, I just couldn't even take in all of that. I had to turn away from it. I mean, I was fascinated by the points you made, the whole thing about whiteness and hierarchy and the privilege of all of that fascinated me. But it was like after this long last 13, 14 months and what we went through politically, it was like I just had to turn away and work on projects, you know, and I sort of kept one part of my being listening to that. But I you know, I think we all have a sense of what that's really all about. And, you know, royalty is a very strange thing in and of itself. And I get very uncomfortable when royalty is so exalted and it becomes the thing we look at. I really actually rather Elvis's kind of role as royalty than people who were born into royalty. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, I think the conversations about it are interesting because it is interesting if people have this either defensiveness of the crown and of royalty, and, you know, they are seen as the ones who betrayed it, versus a defensiveness of that, which tends to be a national divide, you know, of the Brits who are vested in that versus like Americans who have no real sense of loyalty to the crown, who are probably more inclined to be defensive of this couple and sort of their own rights.
Oh, interesting, yes.
But it, you know, as a really choppy translation, to get to it, is in the context of royalty and of ownership. I do want to talk, you know, you had mentioned before, Annie, about funding for this film and getting trust, and also mentioned within the film. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Do you want me to mute you, Ralph?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be right back, yes.
So on this note, though, of ownership and copyright, which is both part of the theme of the film and also very much part of the obstacles of getting it made. And I'd like to hear you just say a little bit more. I'm particularly interested in this relationship between how you get funding for a project that presents the threat of being shut down by the owners of those images and likeness and all of that.
Yeah, I was actually trying to fund it that made me hyper aware of it, honestly, because I was presenting it for things like fiscal sponsorship many, many years ago, and people who documentarians whose work was mostly on PBS and public television. And they were all coming at me with so much fear and trepidation, and all of their questions were about licensing and the rights, and none of them were about the story at all. And that's when I started to realize, oh, maybe this is more of a problem than I thought. And so that's when I solicited the help of a friend who became my co-producer, Sarah Terrio, who was working in TV at the time, and she was doing a lot of clearances. And then she told me, yeah, you absolutely can't do this and this and this. I said, I really don't see why, because, you know, it seems, you know, because of the intention that I came from, and my background was really more in the arts, and so I didn't see it as commercial endeavor, and I saw it as expression. And so I just started reading the case law, and I started to like feel bolder about my choices, and because there were precedents, and we'd have all these arguments because I had to explain to her that what she was telling me was not grounded in the law, but in practice, which is very valid. I mean, things get determined by practice, and that's what broadcasters look at. And so that's a reality. When you want to distribute it, you have to look at practice and not the law. But granted, this was, you know, the early 2000s, and there wasn't Creative Commons yet. Larry Lessig hadn't yet written Free Culture. I later interviewed him for the film, and that was a wonderful scene that got cut. I also had interviewed the owner of Elvis's intellectual property, the billionaire Robert Sillerman, who owned David Beckham and American Idol at the time. And so the laws didn't change, but the zeitgeist that we were operating in did over these 20 years, you know, where suddenly then we had American University came out with a statement of best practices in fair use. That was very empowering. That enabled insurance carriers, errors and omissions, to actually be willing to cover fair use films. And so a lot did change, fortunately, over the making of it.
I'd love to hear more about what that conversation with Elvis's estate owner was like, especially since he got cut. I would just love to kind of know, was he supportive of this project, or was there, what was that conversation like?
It was a really interesting conversation because I could tell he'd never really done interviews before. He was open to it. I was very, very lucky because I caught him. He went to the same undergraduate school I did, and he started a philanthropy program there, and it was the inauguration of it, and I happened to live in town still, so I showed up at the public event.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, and that's how I got to him. And then he said, I'll call you, and weeks went by and I was like, oh, sure. Yeah. My people will call your people. Yeah, whatever. And then I did get a call. I got a call from his assistant, and I really was in disbelief that he was actually remembered and wanted to do it. And we were living in Boston, and we showed up at his Madison Avenue or, Park South fancy office that he said, have you noticed something strange about my office? It has no computer. It's like, I don't think he had a cell phone or a computer because he didn't need one. He had people for that, so, but he was really interested in having philosophical conversations about these issues, even though, he has a stake in the game as the owner. And he wasn't actually the estate. They did things a funny way. They kept the Elvis Presley Enterprises, and then he owned pretty much everything, but they owned the house and shares in his company. But when I first met him and I gave him the old postcard of the film, which had the same 3 images, but it looked different, the first thing he did when he took it is he said, the trifecta. So wow. Yeah. And I asked him, would he buy the other 2? And he thought about it. And I'm pretty sure, and I'd have to look at the transcript, but I'm pretty sure he said that he'd been contacted by the Vatican, before, like just maybe for marketing advice or something like that. So sometimes these things have more synergy or like interrelatedness in reality than I give them credit for, and it's not just something that maybe came together in my mind. But I would push him on aspects of, because Erica Doss is a academic sociologist who teaches at Boulder, and she wrote this book called Elvis Culture, Fans, Faith, and Image. And her main point in that is that this idea of controlling the image when it goes too far, it really stifles the reach of the appeal of Elvis Presley, because of the fact that his image can be read so broadly and it can mean so many different things to people that he has so much reach. So as soon as you start to limit that, you limit the appeal in some way. So I found that he was like saying both. He wanted both things and didn't see them in contradiction. And so we went around that a bit. And I was recently thinking I really did want to revisit that, and we're doing DVD bonuses now, so maybe you'll find it there.
I do want to invite the audience up to ask any questions that they have. The way that's going to work for everyone who hasn't been here, what we will do is you can either type your question into the Q&A box, and then I typically will invite you up to speak as a panelist and ask your question, at which point you can turn on your video or just turn on your mic, whichever you want. If you don't want that, just say in your question that you'd rather me read it, and I'll do that. Alternatively, you could just raise your hand as an attendee. So while we sort of wait for those to kind of be collected, I guess, are there any other kind of tales from the film, maybe potential DVD bonus footage that you can kind of think back to, and like the ones that you really wish you could have kept in there but just didn't really fit the narrative, or any other sort of stories like that come to mind here?
Well, I could have made a whole film about Ralph, quite honestly. And then somebody else did, so you guys should check that one out too. In Love's Shadow. I think it's on Vimeo. But yeah, we spent a lot of time with Ralph, and it's a film, so you can only put so much. This is not a direct answer to your question, but today is the actual anniversary of Pope John Paul II's funeral. So it was 16 years ago today that we were there filming that. And there are so many stories about that, because just the sacrifices we made shooting, and to think that the only scene you see from that moment is his body lying in state. There's nothing of his funeral, which we shot for an entire day and didn't eat or use the toilets or like drink water. But it was, we actually recently just blogged about, we have a Medium blog, and you can read some of those stories there. But I remember just, we got accredited, but we still had to make our way through the crowds of people from our where we were staying in Vatican City, which should have taken us maybe 10 minutes to walk to. And 3 hours later, we weren't sure if we would get to the place we had to be, because it was person at a time, excuse me, with all your equipment, and person by person getting through a mob of people. And when we finally did get where we had to go, we didn't actually have, they had issued us these fluorescent green vests, and all of the various kinds of security who didn't understand my English and who had various rifles, and like they didn't seem to know what my green vest meant. And when we finally did make it to the place we were supposed to be, which is this winding staircase that gets you to the top of the colonnade overlooking the St. Peter's Square, there were so many other media from around the world there. And I was just thinking, how did any of these people get here? Was there a back entrance? Because did they brave that crowd of people who are sleeping in the streets? Anyway, that was 16 years ago, but I remember it like it was yesterday.
I'm just picturing like reporters just parachuting out of a helicopter and sliding their way in.
Next time I will do that.
All right, Rhoda Pell has a question. Rhoda, I'm going to invite you up to the panel right now. And like I said before, feel free to turn your video on if you want, or you can just keep audio only.
Okay. All right. Hi.
Hi.
Boy, I adored this film, and I feel so grateful to have been able to be at this Q&A. So you're welcome. And to have Ralph here too is just awesome, and the moderators. So I couldn't help thinking, of course, with the Pope and then all the choir boys on video. There was no mention, of course, of the sexual abuse. It had to be, in the backs of our minds. And I just wanted to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really heavy time. I was living in Boston at the time, and I was spending time with the youth. So I did experience that with them. It was a really hard time for the priests too, because they felt all these eyes on them, yeah, I mean, there's so many things that happened through the course of this film, and so many different sides of politics and everything, and there's so much that isn't included. And so it just didn't feel part of this story directly.
Right. But it's just marvelous. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rhoda. It's a great question. I'll change you back to attendee. We have a question that Toby Coleman wants me to read this for them, which is, where will the film be shown? I want to share with numerous people. And I do want to add to that question too, if you can elaborate on this answer of how distribution is affected by that, what the copyright law that gives you access to this stuff. So if you can kind of weave that answer in there as well.
Yeah, well, thank you, Toby. That is so nice to hear. And I will say that this film's survival will depend on you. Each of you, I mean, if each of you tell 5 of your friends to see it, it just only exists, as you know, with viewers. So thank you. I'm going to actually post, oh, shoot. I had these links, but they're not appearing as links. So I'm just going to put the website later and after I answer the question. But we did take a different approach to distribution because of the age we're living in now. We were really fortunate, one, to work with great lawyers to get this fair use opinion letter. So we do have the insurance and we can seek distribution. So if you or anyone you know are a distributor, we are open to that. In the meantime, we don't want to waste time not showing the film and not finding our audience directly. Things like this have been so meaningful to us. And so we were lucky also to get a grant from Grant for the Web to enable our self-distribution. So we're doing that at the same time. So we premiered on our own platform at the-faithful, so it's the-faithful.com. And we did 7 live screenings there, and we had 1,000 people attend over 3 days. And at the same time, so Grant for the Web is made up of the foundations at Creative Commons, Mozilla, and Coil. And Coil is this brand new mechanism for monetizing the internet. So it gets a little bit complicated, but I think you can follow. So for $5 a month, we can all support the internet we want. So, and by that, I mean a non-ad based internet, so that the money that we spend, the $5, is directly supporting whatever it is we're looking at online. So that could be this film, it could be a community newspaper, it could be anything at all. And so on our website, you can choose to stream the film right now for $5, or you can pay $5 for this monthly subscription to the whole other side of the internet, and the film will be free too for the same. So you get this free subscription. You can always cancel at the end of the month and get to see the film for $5 and just give it a try, because I just really think they're doing really good things. It was our way of pushing that one step closer to reality, because it's such a dream right now. For it to work, it just needs a critical mass of people there. So we're doing the self-release. We are looking for theatrical partners in August that will correspond with Elvis Weeks and with Diana's Death, which is end of August. And then we're also talking to more universities about doing a university run in come fall, and then maybe streaming at not our streaming, but the big streamers come the new year. So yeah, and let me see, I will just post a link to our site here, but thank you for asking. We also are all on all of the social sites, and we're posting photos each day from the 20-year archive. So that is also easy to find, The Faithful.
I don't know, Annie, did you type those into the chat? I just didn't.
You know, I had, but then they were hyperlinks and they just didn't translate. It just said Facebook, and so I didn't.
Oh, that's odd. All right. Oh, I see. Yeah, I see the link to the website there, though. That's good.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if anyone else has anything they want to bring in. We're running near the end of time. I'm gonna do another question that is, again, sort of a tangent, but it's been nagging at my mind. So I think that what's fascinating to me about the Trump presidency is his base is perhaps the closest we've seen as a fan base in its following to any other candidate. You know, it has production of memorabilia and imagery. that is so linked into it. There's a graphic design component that is very built into it. Obama had some of this, but I think Trump is very much the brand president and the fan president. And, you know, I know that this is very tangential, but I'm just very curious of, as people who look at the imagery of fandom, who have been entrenched in fandom, if that has, especially when it's linked to what I would argue are such toxic and harmful ideologies, if it has all affected your ability to understand that group and perhaps even see humanity in them in a way that maybe others outside of it might not, or it does not quite translate that way. I don't know, there's a lot to that question. I'm basically asking you to unpack like the Trump presidency in a question, but
I think Annie can do it.
I was just about to hand it off to you. Well, for the humanity factor, Ralph, yeah, you must take that one. I mean, Ralph is able to find the humanity in everyone, which I think is so important, you know, and it's the only way we can build bridges, right, and get anywhere. At the same time, there are things that are quite alarming that we have seen, and we've seen in history charismatic. I still have a hard time with that word associated with him. I don't see it, so I don't. People say there's charisma. I see zero charisma, so I don't know. But the branding part, I'm always so frustrated with the candidates I'm rooting for. Like, I don't understand. Obama was a great branding. Of course, they came after the that for copyright infringement too. I remember someone I worked with was working on the Hillary campaign and was so frustrated that they didn't have merchandise to deliver. He was going door to door, you know, and he didn't have things to give out. So, I mean, part of, I don't know, it's a tangent, but being able to speak in sound bites is helpful in politics. But it leaves no room for the nuance and the gray. That's really where the truth lies, you know. So it's like, and so, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and this was always a tough space for me. I photographed not extensively, but obviously I went to Trump gatherings and Trump rallies and photographed. And on a one-to-one level, I found no difficulties. As an aggregate, I was abhorred the whole time. And I still don't know what to make of that. But I think you're right, Matt. I think it had a lot to do with fandom. Trump was more than just a president. He was a savior. He was a savior of a certain group of people. And this whole thing built up around him. I mean, I don't think I went, the last couple of Trump gatherings I went to, I don't think anyone was there who did not have some sort of Trump thing on them, either hat or shirt or carrying a flag. I mean, it was pretty, I mean, it really reminded me of images from the 20s and 30s that I'm familiar with. And how that takes root and how people find it's a parallel thing. It's not quite the same as I think is what Annie and I worked in, because ostensibly both Annie and I would argue, I think, that there is a transcendental nature, perhaps, to what we were exploring. There was some attempt at a different connection, and I saw that not at all in the Trump phenomenon. I mean, it was so temporal and so rooted to this earth, to this country. But nonetheless, I mean, again, on a one-to-one basis, I had great conversations with people. I just avoided the subjects that I knew would end the great conversation. But it was always, you know, I mean, I just photographed and worked and tried to understand them. I don't.
Yeah, I mean, that aspect of transcendentalism you're pointing to there, I think there's so much more we could kind of unpack from that. I will wrap up on this last question we have from the audience, which is from Alexander McNabb, who says, in a 20-year-long production, how did you know when you were finally ready to stop filming?
Yeah.
That's good.
I think every year I was like, that's it. I guess Ralph speaks about that too. He just talked about, you know, he'd leave and say, okay, I'm done. And then you go back. So Yeah. At some point, I just did stop going back. You know, I think maybe it was the being there some years and just not feeling that inspiration to shoot. And so then you think, if I'm not shooting, why am I here? Because you realize you have everything. You know, it's a kind of like being in Groundhog's Day, the Bill Murray movie. You know, you're like, you're about to cross the street and you're about to light, yeah, and then you're gonna say this and you're gonna say that exactly that way. Oh my gosh, I'm still here.
Annie and I would talk to each other on the phone often before the August 15th, 16th, 17th period. And the question was always, are you going back? Are you going back? Well, I might go back. Well, I might go back. And that went on for a number of years like that. We would see each other at Graceland, but there was always a tenuousness to our decision-making process. And sometimes I think we encouraged the other to go. I always was afraid that I would miss something. I mean,
me too. Me too.
I figured I had photographed everything possible to photograph there, but I just knew that if I didn't go one year, something else would show up or something, you know, and I'd miss it. So I tended to go back and hang around, just waiting for that moment that distilled all of the human questions into, you know, one moment.
There was one year that, and you were actually there then too. I had never gone for the birthdays. I'd always gone for the death weeks. And, but when the estate was sold to Robert Sillerman, that happened to be right before January, which was the birthday. And so I went and I really just, it felt to me like a major shift, like the Reformation or something, you know, it was like, like, what now? And will people be supportive or not? And none of that made that into the film, but I was very interested in that. And I remember Rockin' Robin, who you remember in the film, she was wearing a shirt that said WWED, what would Elvis do? And so when I asked her the question, she turned around and she said, yeah, that's why I'm wearing this shirt. And what would Elvis do?
I don't want to say to everyone, I had the pleasure, the privilege, and I must also say the torture of watching Annie go through this 20-year period. And we became friends, and I would, you know, she'd be telling me about the film and where it was, and then suddenly there'd be silence. And I knew that something was happening. And then there'd be another sort of center core of the film. And this thing just evolved as Annie evolved as a person. And for me, it was both, it was a gift, but it was also a terror. I mean, I was convinced that this was going to go on for 50 years, and I would have to keep going back to Graceland for this period. But as we all found out, Annie turned all of this interest into an elegant, beautiful, poetic tone poem that I think is unrivaled in the genre she did that in.
Thank you, Ralph. I mean, your work continues to be an inspiration, and Ralph's work extends way beyond the Elvis stuff. It's just what he becomes most known for because of our interest in it. But you know, but the other work is really worth seeing. If is there a way to see it, Ralph, online or?
Well, I have a website, but I had the lack of foresight to build it in Flash. So only 7 people on the planet can see it right now. But I am building a new website, but it's ralphburnsphotography.com. And if you get Flash, you see a little trailer kind of piece that shows some of the other work. I'm just working now only for the reason that in case I am lucky enough to get an obituary anywhere when I die, they do not use the photograph from the Elvis Project. I'm just trying to get something to replace that. And that's...
Yeah, but don't ever die. No, but back at the longevity part, and when I first, because we'd met at Graceland, and then one time we went to his studio, Ralph's studio, to do the actual interview. And I remember understanding that it started in '77 and the number of years. And at that point, maybe I'd been working on it at most 5 years. And so I thought, that is
Great.
never going to be me. That is never. So, yeah. So to hear you say that is funny to me now, because I remember very clearly thinking, you were that person, not me.
Yeah. I've spent much of my life becoming the person I said I wouldn't be. So, it seems to be what we do.
Yeah.
I did the same thing. I said, my parents are psychologists. I said, I'll never go into psychology. I don't want to go to school till I'm 30. Now I'm 32 and getting a PhD in something adjacent to psychology. So,
And I congratulate you on that choice, by the way.
Yes.
Getting a PhD is a wonderful idea.
I'm so grateful to have you both here tonight. This has been such a wonderful talk, and Ralph said it perfectly, Annie. I think the film is really brilliant, and I feel so lucky to have been able to talk to you about it. So
thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank everyone.
Much. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks all of you for sticking with us. And Annie, I want to buy a DVD when it's ready. I want to see those bonus features. So I'll be.
Thank you, Matt. Oh, I do have one of the links that didn't go through is a survey, but I think that we can email it all out, and it's really short. So so hopefully you can all get a chance to just spend 5 minutes and give some feedback that way, because that will also help us, because one of the questions is about DVDs. So it reminded me.
Send that to Alex, and I think he has
Okay.
a list of attendees' email, so he can blast this whole group with that.
Great. So prepare to be blasted.
All right. Well, thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks,
wonderful.
everyone.
Great questions.
Yeah, really fantastic. Yeah.
All right. Take care.
Hope to see you again. Bye.
Yeah, absolutely.